Welcome everyone at the CERGE-EI Distinguished Speaker Seminar Series. My name is Marek Kapička and I'm a faculty member here at CERGE-EI. CERGE-EI has been organizing the seminar series since its inception in 1991, and this is the 13th seminar in this series. And over the years we had many Nobel Prize winners, and today we have one as well. CERGE-EI, you may know, it stands for Center for Graduate Education and Economic Research, and is a joint project of the Charles University and the Economics Institute of the Academy of Sciences. Before introducing Finn, let me just say thanks to our sponsor, the Tatra Banka Foundation, who made this lecture possible. Finn Kydland is the Jeff Henley Professor of Economics at the University of California in Santa Barbara, where I had the pleasure of being his colleague for many years. I could now list a long list of appointments and positions and visiting positions and consultant positions that Finn has had over the years. Let me cut it short a little bit and just say that there's one place that's prominent on his CV, and that's the Carnegie Mellon University. Finn has obtained his PhD at Carnegie in 1973 and became a faculty member a few years later. Then he left and came back to Carnegie before going to UC Santa Barbara. And you may or may not know that Carnegie in 1970s was a place where modern macroeconomics was born. Besides Finn, Kydland at Prescott was there, Bob Lucas was there, and other prominent macroeconomists. And they were changing the foundation of modern macro. And no one has changed it more than Finn together with at Prescott. And they were awarded for their contributions to macroeconomics the Nobel Prize in 2004. And the Nobel Committee lists two contributions. The first one is a contribution to the study of business cycles. So what Finn and Ed did, they wrote down a model of business cycles that looked completely different from any other business cycle model that we had at the time. Most of the business cycles models were Keynesian business cycle models. So their model, it had people in it, people making choices. People were dynamically optimizing in the face of uncertainty, and it was a model where markets cleared. It was an equilibrium model. It was also a model that unified the business cycle theory with other parts of macroeconomics, especially the growth theory. And if you look at modern macro nowadays, you see lots of models, and they are obviously different from the original Kydland and Prescott model. They feature things like sticky prices, money, labor market frictions, and other things that were not present in their original contribution. But virtually all modern macro models have Kydland and Prescott's original model at its core. So their contribution changed in a fundamental way the way we think about macroeconomic issues. So as if that was not enough for a Nobel Prize, the Nobel Committee cites a second contribution, which is on a time consistency of economic policy. I'm not going to say much about this because that second contribution is going to be featured in today's Finn's talk, which is innovation and capital formation in today's policy environment. So with that, I just leave the floor to Finn. And you can.
May I stand on here? I feel uncomfortable still. Thank you very much, Marek, for those nice words. And thank you all for coming. This is my and my wife's second time in Praha. In Norway, we learned that the name of the city is Praha, and so that's what I've always called it. We were here 10 years ago, and Tanya and I talked about it last night. We realized 10 years is way too long to be away from this beautiful city. And of course, we enjoyed it. I enjoy it. Tanya doesn't get to come here, but I enjoyed very much here. I spent the day at CERGE, talked to several people, and I know there's some impressive research going on here. What I like to talk about, the talk will be somewhat topical. I would argue that it's related to what is going on today and what has been going on for a number of years. The focus is somewhat motivated by what I have seen across different parts of the world. You often hear journalists and others talking about as if the only problem or the main problem that has occurred in the past 10 years, let's say, they're related to the financial crisis around 2008. So what I will talk about will be somewhat different from what many talk about. When I look across different parts of the world, it looks to me that what has happened is sufficiently different across different parts, sufficiently different that there's got to be something else going on. And that's what I'll try to focus on. What I will argue going on has to do with differences in economic policy in different regions of the world. Now, I won't talk about the whole world, of course, but I will focus on parts of Europe. I will focus on the United States, and if I have time at the end, I will also give my impression of China. So with those portions of the world, that covers a pretty high percentage of areas where economic activity takes place. But before I get started, it's always good to get a little bit of a big picture of some parts of the world. This is a little idiosyncratic, I suppose. It may look so, but I think it's kind of interesting because the differences across parts of the world. So in this picture, this is real GDP per capita going back to 1950. Purchasing power corrected, dollars, 2005 US dollars. So they should be as comparable as economists can make different countries. Real GDP corresponds to real income by and large. And in this picture, you see at the top United States and Canada pretty much following each other. I could have included other countries for various reasons. A country like Qatar, where Tanya and I just spent 6 weeks this winter, they would be way up here, but although they've fallen a little bit lately. Modesty kept me from including my home country, Norway, in the picture. So you have those two countries. Then I would say we have a collection of 4 countries, and they're all East Asian countries. These are Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And these countries have all grown at very respectable rates. Japan, as we know, has slowed down, but they're still up there. The next collection of countries, I would say, are, well, I chose 3 Latin American countries. Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. And they have grown. I mean, they weren't that far away from these East Asian countries if you go back to the 50s, but they have really slowed down. They have grown very sluggishly. So it's interesting to think about what is it about these collections of countries? Is there something about their institutions that makes them behave so consistently different? What could it be? Just for fun, I know this is a fairly new country. So is Slovakia, where I just spent 3 days. These are also 2 new countries. They came about as a consequence of the breakup of the Soviet Union. They're Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. I like to include them because I've been to each of them 3 or 4 times. They happen to organize some well-attended conferences. And I regard these 2 countries, they are both resource rich, and they have seemingly managed their resources well. They had a rough time in the beginning, but they have really showed considerable growth rates. One thing to remind you of, all students know this, of course, so this plot is not on proportional scale, so a given slope of a curve far down in this picture corresponds to a much higher growth rate, much higher annual growth rate than the same slope high up in the picture. So these are really quite spectacular growth rates. When you talk to people in Kazakhstan, they will say, we have a big problem. But it turns out to be quite a benign problem. They say, we have grown so fast, now we have it's very difficult to find people with the right skills to keep the growth momentum going. That's not a bad problem to have. And they are taking the consequences. They are upgrading existing universities. They have built new universities. They are trying to expand the educational system in general. Pretty wise decisions. Then at the very bottom, this purple line is China. And China gets a lot of press these days. There's talk about China in maybe 5 years becoming the largest country in the world in terms of economic activity. Well, that may be, but if you look at GDP or income per capita, China is not doing so well. It's true the growth has picked up, but they are still very low in terms of per capita GDP and per capita income. So I hope I have time to get back to China. As a professor, I never give a talk without bothering the audience with some economic theory. Is that okay? And I'll talk. The basis for my talk, there are 2 essential pieces of theory that I want to bring up. One is I want to remind you of the aggregate production function, which describes how inputs of capital and labor get, they interact and they produce output of goods and services. So GDP will consist of consumption, investment, government purchases, Uh, so this is a function of capital and labor input, capital being the sum of all the factories, machines, office buildings in the nation, labor being the all the hours of labor input going into production. Of course, these are difficult concepts. They consist of not very uniform items. Capital, for some purposes, we may want to distinguish between structures and equipment. In the case of labor input, nobody measures labor input. I'm not aware of any series for labor input. And the reason I say that, labor input isn't just adding up all the hours workers work. Because in production, it makes a difference, big difference, what your skills are to produce in the market sector. Many people, including all the students here, you're accumulating human capital. The idea is that you will become relatively skillful at doing whatever you choose to do. Lots of people choose not to educate themselves to that extent. Workers learn by doing, etc. So ideally, as a labor input, we should weight the hours by how skillful people are. But that's a very difficult thing to do, and so I'm not aware of any series that that you can look up for any country and get numbers for L. But as a theoretical concept, very important. You know, there's work where the researchers find that it's important to think about the interaction of the different kinds of skills with different kinds of capital. These days, there's some talk about changes in inequality, and for example, for that kind of issue, that may turn out to be important. What's important for me today will be the Z and the K. So the Z I can call the technology level or total factor productivity. This Z is extremely important because it's what generates long-run growth sustainably. Growth may take place on shorter-term basis for other reasons, but for the long run, this Z is a key factor. But Z cannot work by itself. Well, it could, but if Z grows, then output would grow steadily, even if K and N didn't change. But Z, the thing about Z is it makes capital more productive. So one would expect that there should be capital accumulation to take advantage of the rise in Z, unless somehow in the economy there are incentives that will prevent people from, or businesses from being willing to do so. And those kinds of incentives, I will argue, often come from the government. In some regions of the world, there happen to be fairly strong disincentives to capital accumulation. My center, Laboratory for Aggregate Economics and Finance, we once had a conference. We like to put on very focused conferences. We had a conference entitled The TFP Puzzle in Latin America. And we had 12 people coming to give talks and so on. And the nice thing about having a focused conference is it may change your view about what's going on in the world. And it turned out Latin America, it's not so much a total factor productivity puzzle. It's more of a capital accumulation puzzle. So evidently there's something about Latin America, or some Latin American countries, uh, discouraging businesses from taking advantage of technological change. So I have studied a couple of countries. The idea is you can learn a lot by observing different countries, what policies they follow. The time period in question happened to be about the same from the early 1990s to mid 2000, I think 2005 or so. One is a very positive example, and one I regard as a very negative example. And I'll leave it to you to guess which is which. Let me now get to the second piece of theory, and that's what Marek mentioned, the discovery that optimal government policy is time inconsistent. Optimal. I emphasize optimal government policy is time inconsistent. If you're students of economics, you know we like to work with abstractions, and we are free to imagine that suppose there were a benign policymaker who had worked out a mathematical expression for what the citizens' welfare would be currently and indefinitely into the future. And he was saddled with the task of choosing policy so as to make welfare as high as possible. Now, there's an important aspect of economic theory that arises from what I've just talked about. And all of this ties in with innovation and capital formation. That's why I chose the title I did. These are very forward-looking decisions. So they typically involve large expense when they take place, when the innovative activities take place, when the capital accumulation take place. Building a factory may cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and the benefits come far into the future. They start flowing in as long as after the innovative project turned out to be successful, or when the capital is finished and ready to produce. So in order to assess whether these projects are a good idea, it's kind of a complicated decision, because you have to assess whether these the present value of the returns from doing it are worth the high cost. And here's where the government comes into the picture, because for example, the tax environment, maybe the regulatory environment more generally, that could be expected several years into the future, will play a role in the calculation of the worth of these projects. And that's really the reason for the time inconsistency, because when this policymaker were to choose his optimal policy plan, obviously he or she would take into account the effect the future of his policy plan would have on earlier decisions today, for example. But here's where the problem comes in. If you move, say, 5 years into the future, and if you were to recalculate that optimal plan, then nothing has changed in terms of the objective function or the economic environment per se, he would calculate a completely different plan. And the reason is, now he part of what resulted from the continuation of his original plan was the decisions that were made during the first 5 years. But those decisions have already been made. And so now there's a temptation to change the plan, especially if the view in the government is that we're in a bit of an emergency, we need some funding for various reasons, and for some reason it's easy for politicians to think of such reasons. So this suggests that there's a need for a commitment mechanism to ensure that consistent and good economic policy is pursued. So this is a theoretical finding, and you could argue when you think about the way policy is being conducted in practice, it's even worse. The way time inconsistency tends to manifest itself intuitively, policy looks very short-run oriented. So Argentina, to me, as an example where policy is always focused on the next 6 months or a year, never on the long run. But the long run is what's really important, much more so than the short run. So the temptation to change policy is great, would be predicted to be greater where something you've accumulated is involved. Like you've accumulated capital already, imagining some future policy environment, but now the factor is already there, so there's a temptation for politicians to change the tax policy, or well, government debt is something that's accumulated. And this temptation has been especially prevalent in Latin America, where when the government felt there was emergency need for revenue, they basically inflated away the debt. Many such examples. Argentina is an example in the 1980s, called the lost decade. The 1980s ended up with a huge hyperinflation. Hyperinflation, that's where the percentage increases in the price level are on the order of hundreds of percent or even in the thousands. And when that happens, the real value of the outstanding debt shrinks to zero, virtually. And of course, causing great pain to pensioners and others who had accumulated those assets for the future. Now, we could ask, are there examples of commitment mechanisms, the kinds I was talking about here? Well, the example always mentioned is that of an independent central bank. So the idea is to have a organization or an entity making monetary policy independent of political pressure from the rest of the government. And historically, different countries have done differently in that respect. The United States is pretty good in terms of independence. Probably the best example was the Bundesbank, although they're not doing economic policy by themselves anymore. And one of the worst examples is Argentina. So just to give a sense of how different two countries can be, by the way, there have been studies where central banks were ranked according to their independence, let's say on a scale of 1 to 5, and then correlated with how good economic monetary policy has been, and there's a clear positive correlation. Now, we're in a truly independent central bank. I should also mention that England is an example where monetary policy, they realized we have to make it independent, so the central bank used to be under the regular government, but then in 1997 made independent. In Scandinavia, their central banks are basically independent. Now, So the United States is an example where they were ranked pretty high. And one thing you see about a central bank that represents a fairly good commitment mechanism, the chairman tends to sit for quite a while, cover more than one administration, for example. If you look at the United States going back to 1951, a period of 60-something years, 63, 64 years, until Janet Yellen was appointed beginning of this year, until she's only the 7th. So before that, over 60 years, there were only 6. So they each sat for an average of more than 10 years. How about Argentina? Well, Argentina Central Bank was created in 1945. If you go back, if you look up Wikipedia, you can see a list of all the central bank heads back to 1945. So that would be 70 years, just about. How many heads of the Central Bank of Argentina do you think there have been? 25? You're a little bit off. The answer is 56. So, which means that on the average, the head sat for a year and a quarter. There was an especially tumultuous year, 2002, when the head of the Central Bank of Argentina changed 3 times in 1 year. And if you read the paper, you will have heard about one of the latest incidents. I actually met the guy who was central bank head for actually unusually many years, from about 2004 until 2010, Martin Redrado. It's a difficult name to pronounce, but so he seemed to be like a fairly reasonable guy. But then in around 2010, 11, I forget exactly when, Cristina Fernandez Kirchner, who's the president, decided she wanted her hands on the central bank's reserves. Martin refused. What do you think happened? Out he goes. Replaced by someone else. And since then, I believe the head has changed 3 times, because Cristina Kirchner has pretty firm ideas what she likes the head of the central bank to do. Meantime, Argentina is one of the worst examples of economic policy making. Let me now focus on Europe. So I'll talk about some areas of Europe, then I'll talk about the United States, then I'll talk about China, and I'm done. In this picture, there's a collection of European countries, and I would say here there are 2 groups of countries. There's a top group, quite consistently. These are Germany, France, Great Britain, and just to include a country that's a little smaller than these other, Austria. So they follow each other pretty well over this entire period. Below them is a collection of 4 other countries, and these are Greece, Spain, Italy, and Ireland. Okay, so they follow each other here until 1990. And then one of those 4 countries takes off. Within a decade, it has surpassed all of these 4 top countries. Now, you may wonder what happened in Ireland, and there's always more than one factor, but so Ireland, in some sense, they had a pretty good precondition in 1990. about 20 years earlier, decided to make secondary education free of charge. And so you could say by 1990, they found themselves with a potentially skillful workforce, but had no machines to work with. Well, we're stating it, but so what did Ireland do? One thing the politicians did was they said, if you, foreign company or domestic company, if you set up shop in Ireland, these will be your tax rates next year, that's 1992, 93, all the way to 2009. They made tax policy completely certain. That, you may argue, makes it much easier to do the calculations you need to do to decide whether a project is a good idea or not. And, well, you see the effect. So that was a great decision by the Irish government. And one wishes this story had a better ending. The Irish government also failed in one sense, because as Ireland got into the 2000s, the Irish banks started giving out loans, mortgage loans, construction loans, and so on, that turned out exposed to have been a very bad idea. Ireland, when the financial crisis hit in 2008, major Irish banks were basically illiquid, or bankrupt, and the government decided to bail them out. Which an economist that decision, an economist has every reason to criticize for several reasons. One is to saddle the taxpayer with these losses as a result of bad banking decisions, to me is scandalous. It also raises questions about the incentives for banking behavior in Ireland in the future. What does this say about the benefits to excessive risk-taking in the future if you can expect the government to bail you out? So the sense in which the government made bad decisions in the 2000s, it's not just because they decided to bail out the banks, but also they didn't put, implicitly they insured the banking system, but they didn't put in place a regulatory environment to prevent the banks from taking advantage of it. And that's a principle in economics. You don't insure something without such a regulatory environment. Anyway, so Ireland, but Ireland is still a spectacular example, and there's still not too badly off. But they, after crisis hit in Greece, Ireland was among the countries mentioned as a potential future problem country. Ireland, along with Spain, Italy, and Portugal. These four countries were often mentioned as potential future problem countries in the eurozone. So I decided to take a look at, often the membership in the eurozone is mentioned as a potential problem for these countries. So I decided to take a look at the data to plot the best measure we have of the Z in the production function, total factor productivity, for these four countries. So here we have, let's see, what's the order of them? We have Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Ireland. These pictures are on proportional scale. So, I mean, The way you do that, you take logs, natural logs, and then you plot them. And proportional scale means that if growth is constant, annual growth is constant, the corresponding line will be a straight line. So then it's easy to see if both far down in the picture and high up in the picture what the growth rate is. The straight lines in each of these pictures, they represent the average growth rate from 1960 to 1990 and then extended to the present. And these are acceptable growth rates. But what's shocking, when I saw these, I thought, these are among the most shocking pictures I've ever seen. Because after the early 90s, productivity growth, TFP growth, slowed down completely in 3 of those countries. Of course, labor productivity, if you take output produced divided by hours of work, that's very much related to total factor productivity. Not exactly, because it depends in part on capital accumulation taking place and so on, but and also about the skill composition of workers. But by and large, it should give a fairly similar picture. And as you can see, labor productivity in those 3 nations has slowed down pretty much similarly to the TFP picture. Not in Ireland. There's been some slowdown lately. The first 4 pictures I showed you were indices, so I can't really compare them and say which one is higher in terms of levels. Here I can compare them. Output per hour, I can compare the levels. And if I do for Ireland, even though with a slowdown, Ireland is on the order of 40 to 50% higher than these 3 other countries. That tells me that if Ireland if the Irish play their cards wisely, they should be in good shape. But these countries, unless they can find a way to turn these curves to a positive slope, there's very little hope of long-run prosperity in these countries. So back to the notion that it's really the eurozone that represent the membership in the eurozone that represented the problem. Notice that these slowdowns started well before they became members of the eurozone. I actually think that this talk about the eurozone being a problem is a red herring. Now, my wife warned me that the English expression red herring is not common everywhere in the world. And so I decided to look up the dictionary definition of a red herring. So this is what the dictionary says: something that distracts attention from the real issue. That's exactly how I think about this thing. Okay. Time to look at the United States. In the United States, I think the situation is different, as I'll argue. This is real GDP for the United States going back to 1947. 47 is when reliable data started being published on a quarterly basis. Here the straight line represents the average growth from 1947 to 2007 and then extended to the present. And it works pretty well. I mean, its basic slope, the basic slope of that straight line, goes pretty much through the actual curve. There are some ups and downs around it. That's what we call the business cycle. But by and large, this curve works well. By the way, another advantage of doing things on proportional scale is that deviations from the trend, I mean the magnitude in terms of centimeters, 2 centimeters deviation down here corresponds to the same percentage deviation as 2 centimeters up here. So until 2008, these cycles looked, they looked fairly, I mean, there's certainly irregularity, but among the typical features were, so you hit the bottom and then a quick recovery. They also tended to be associated with the downturns that tended to be associated with slowdown in total factor productivity, Z. The latest one is very unusual. In fact, let's focus on it. It's very unusual for at least 3 or 4 reasons. The magnitude of the drop. How far below the straight line are we here? And the answer is 12%. That's a pretty big drop. In previous business cycle, the biggest deviation from the trend had been on the order of 4 or 5%. Unless you go back to the Great Depression in the early 30s. So that's one difference. 2, no sign of even getting closer to the old trend. Growth since then has been slower than the average growth in previous years, previous decades, and so we're moving further away from the old trend. Third, at least initially, there wasn't a slowdown in the Z, the TFP, that we typically see in a recession. Fourth, what really slowed down was investment behavior. Consumption held up reasonably well. Actually, to an extent that I remember a couple of years ago, there was a half-page article in Wall Street Journal talking about the puzzle of why consumption was holding up so well. So why might this be? One background to think about is it's been known for a decade or two that the US government budget could run into big difficulty once the so-called baby boomers start retiring. So in the United States, if you look at the age distribution of the population, there's a big hump at some point, and the people who are part of that hump, they're coming to the age where many of them already started retiring, but more to come. And because they tend to demand more from the expense side of the government through Social Security, Medicare, and various other ways, and no longer contribute to the income side very much of the government, they will have a negative effect on the government budget constraints. In fact, prediction had been made 20 years ago that when that starts to happen, then tax rates would have to rise by at least 5 percentage points. then on top of that comes this crisis where revenues fall and the government tries some temporary programs of spending and also of temporary tax reductions. Anything temporary like that, even my undergraduates know it's not going to have much of an effect. And so the debt to GDP ratio had started rising towards levels not seen since after World War II. So, and it started to generate a lot of visibility. Everyone talked about it. Newspapers talked about it. So Carlos Sarasaga, who's at the Dallas Fed, and I, we decided to try a computational experiment. That's what the type of thing Prescott and I do. We set up a model economy. We put people in a particular environment, the environment we need for asking our question, and then we start up the computer and we see how they behave. You know, behaving as optimizing, utility maximizing people. We used a very standard model, except we did the following. We imagined, and this was partly motivated also by discussion among politicians about when to call off the temporary tax reduction that George Bush had instituted in 2001. It was scheduled to be to end January 1st, 2011, although politicians postponed it, the end of it till 2013. Then taxes were supposed to go back up. And Carlos and I did the following experiment. The timing is a little arbitrary, of course. And here's an important point about the quantitative importance of the forward-lookingness of modern macroeconomics. The future affects current behavior. We imagined that tax rates on capital income were to go up by a percentage for 10 years, by a percentage large enough to keep the debt to GDP ratio from rising further. And we based our calculation of that tax rate on projections by the Congressional Budget Office, and we came up with a percentage rise in the tax rates and then ran the model. It turns out to account pretty well for many features of what actually happened. This is just an example. What the model said was likely to happen to investment, and that was the variable that moved the most during this recession. The model actually accounts for on the order of 80 or 90% of what happened. It accounts for maybe 40 or 50% of the drop in labor input. It accounts for it's consistent with the Z not slowing down particularly. It's also consistent with, and it's the only, lots of people have tried to come up with explanations. It's the only one I know about that accounts for how well consumption has held up. It's kind of depressing because it suggests that unless politicians do something to remove this uncertainty about, well, I don't know if I made it clear enough, but the assumption was that as of January 2009, businesses anticipated that starting in 2013, for 10 years, tax rates would go up by the amount I suggested. So, as in any modern macroeconomic model, this anticipation of what was of the tax environment that was to start in 2013 has an effect already in 2009, 2010, and so So I would argue this is a big factor in what's been going on in the United States, and probably there could be similarities in other countries, but it certainly seems different from the situation in many parts of Europe. Now, so in the time inconsistency thing, you'll recall that I was careful to talk about it as the time inconsistency of optimal government policy, which in daily usage of English, I would say that's like good economic policy. Now, I think of China as an example where consistent policy is not sufficient. Okay, so the time and consistency principle, it recommends good economic policy in a consistent way that you can depend on and transparent and so on. But consistent policy, to me, is not sufficient. It's not good to have consistent policy and bad policy. So when you kind of look at China, it seems that China is, it seems like one of the most consistent countries there are. You can debate with me, but it seems to me. So I admit, unlike Argentina and Ireland, I haven't studied China particularly myself, except for visiting it. Most of what I know about China, I learned from an article by another Norwegian economist, Kjetil Storsletten, who he's also trained at Carnegie Mellon, and he has become one of the most prominent macroeconomists there are. He wrote a paper with Song and Silibotti. It was published in the American Economics Review about a couple of years ago. It's called Growing Like China. What I learned from that article, to explain it quickly, in China, almost all banks are state-owned banks, or state-run banks. Most large companies are state-owned. Large state-owned companies who have easy access to credit from state-run banks. They have an easy time getting credit. Until a few years ago, they had easy access to cheap labor. They didn't need to be particularly innovative to show considerable profits. Meantime, the entrepreneurs, on whom, in a well-functioning, growing economy, we expect people with ideas coming up with new products, new ways of making things, and so on. They may turn into small, what we call small to medium-sized companies. They have a hard time getting credit to put their ideas to use. Often they have to save up in advance of carrying out the idea. They tend to get biased more towards more labor-intensive activities than otherwise, or than what otherwise would seem optimal. So a conclusion would seem to be, unless China opens up for more competition in the financial sector, they will eventually run into big difficulties. The other implication of this work is they have measures of the extent of resource misallocation that has taken place as a consequence of their policies. And these estimates are humongous. Another way to put it, they could, with the same use of resources, China could have grown substantially faster. Now, I don't often talk so much about the importance of the banking sector, but this is an issue also for countries such as Spain, Portugal, and Italy. How do they reorganize their banking system? And the thinking has to be, how can we do it so that there are the incentives to support the two topics I talk about, innovation and capital accumulation. Here's another example how we can learn from different economic policies and what actually happened. I didn't do this myself. This is taken from a paper by Tim Kehoe and a co-author of his, who has studied Latin American countries and Spain quite extensively. Tim Kehoe is at the University of Minnesota. He and his co-author, they decided to, they made this picture of GDP per working age person, which is basically the same as per capita, not much difference. For Chile, that's the blue line, and for Mexico, this line. And they argue in 1981, these countries were pretty much in the same situation because of big drops in the prices of their main export products, petroleum for Mexico and copper for Chile. Chile, in 1981, they found themselves with banks accounting for half of the nation's deposits illiquid. The government stepped in, decided which ones were viable for the long run. The remaining ones they let go under. The viable ones, they reprivatized within 2 or 3 years. High cost initially, a drop of GDP of 20%. But then interest rates started being quoted, banks started to function pretty well like a banking system can do. Credit flowing to the best users, or approximately so, and Chile took off. Mexico was reluctant to reprivatize the banks. So they put bureaucrats in charge of who would get credit to try to avoid the potential big drop in economic activity. They tended to favor the companies they knew well, and they typically were some of the big companies. If you think bureaucrats are the ones who know the best places for credit to go, what are the best projects, you probably believe in Santa Claus. So in Mexico, it took decades for Mexico to recover even to the level of 1981. Since then, they have reprivatized, and so Mexico is admittedly functioning much better now, but still with some difficulty. But this is meant as an illustration. What you do about the banking sector may play a role for, or is likely to play a role for long-run growth. Let me finish. I don't know. These points I've already made them. Initially, I made an especially big deal of this last one, and I think I do find it quite interesting to see these differences across areas of the world. And to me, it supports the idea that differences in policy making, differences in credibility across nations, or lack of certainty, or extent of uncertainty about future economic policy, probably plays, those factors probably play a significant role in these differences across nations. Okay, so I've already said this, and I do think of that it's appropriate to refer to the time inconsistency disease, and to think of ways to avoid it. But the problem is, okay, so I gave the example of the potential success in monetary policy. The problem is it's much harder to think, how can you commit future governments in the fiscal arena? And I would argue that fiscal policy is way more important for the long run movements of economies than is monetary policy. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Finn.